David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 30 and 3 years over all Israel and Judah. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem, unto the Jebusites, and the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, Except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither, thinking, David cannot come in hither. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion. The same is the city of David. This is the first mention of Zion in the Hebrew Bible. It, understood as a place, here another name for Jerusalem, but eventually more broadly used for the areas of Israel or Palestine, became a central focus of Jewish identity. God, the Hebrew Bible says, promised that land to Jews. It was a divine promise made between the single, the only Creator God, and his chosen, favored people. It was a land that Jews inhabited and united under David, as described in the passage just read. But then it was a land lost. Jews were not a significant power during biblical times, typically only mentioned in passing, if at all, by their far more formidable neighbors, the Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, the Babylonians. What made them special was not their might, but a document, twice now mentioned, that told their history in a dramatized, mythical fashion. That is, of course, the Hebrew Bible, also called the Old Testament among Christians, or in specifically Jewish contexts, is often just the Bible, the book. A central through line of the Bible, arguably the central through line of the Bible, is that divine promise of Zion, the Jewish realization of God's promise of the land. Their power as an ancient polity was broken by the Romans during the 1st century AD, after 2 failed uprisings and the destruction of their sacred Second Temple in Jerusalem. They spread across the earth, forming what's known as the diaspora, a scattered people. But in all the centuries going forward, many believed that their right as a people to Zion was never lost. Jews' relation to Zion would go on to form one of the most controversial and perhaps one of the most misunderstood isms in politics, which is, of course, Zionism. This video series will aim to comprehensively dispel that confusion, explaining thoroughly and systematically what Zionism is. The first thing to understand is that the word Zionism is a modern one. It didn't appear until the end of the 19th century. So to begin our investigation into Zionism, we can start by looking at what was happening in the world. What was happening that made the word Zionism suddenly appear? But even to get into that, we need some context. First, the world used to be a very different place, in a quite specific way, up until the end of the 18th century. The globe, until that point, was arranged in a much more patchwork way. People in a large area might have all considered themselves to be subjects of the same ruler, like a king, for example. But they often considered themselves, more, subjects of some sort of local ruler, like a lord. They probably spoke the language that was associated with their area, like German, for example. But also, maybe not. Maybe they were in an area that people called Germany, but they, and most people in their town, only spoke some sort of Slavic language. And maybe in the next town over, people spoke Yiddish. Technology at the time was much more limited. Travel was much more limited, and communications were much more limited. There was often some amount of broad regional consensus when it came to religion, and even pressure to conform to that religion, and persecutions against those who did not. But within that, in these societies, there was a strong amount of cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity. It wasn't necessarily a problem for these people, living their relatively local lives. It's just how things were. There were still a small number of Jews living in Jerusalem, which was in the broader area of Palestine, as it had been renamed by the Romans. But the vast majority of them, again, were in exile, in the diaspora. In the diaspora, everywhere, they were a minority. In some ways, they would typically acclimate to the area around them, adopting some of their culture and perhaps their language. But they also, over the centuries, maintained a Jewish identity, reading the Bible and observing Jewish cultural and religious traditions. Christian societies, in particular, would typically protect them, on one hand, seeing Judaism as a sort of mother religion, a legitimate and therefore valuable precursor to Christianity. But on the other hand, also seeing Jews as guilty of deicide, justifying some amount of legal discrimination against them, making Jews, in sum, a protected but essentially second-class people. Jews experienced similar protected yet punished status for centuries in Muslim societies. But with the decline of the Islamic Golden Age and the political decay that followed, the relative rise of Europe, and the rise of Muslim intolerance, Jews, by the end of the Middle Ages, came to live, overwhelmingly, scattered across Europe. In the 16th and 17th century, as weapons, communication technology, and state infrastructure developed, the age of absolute monarchs began. Monarchs began to centralize their states, bringing their subjects together as one more cohesive political unit. These centralizing monarchs then, more than ever before in European history, set the stage for these societies to think of themselves as one cohesively unified national whole. Politics in the Middle Ages had largely been seen through the lens of religion, but these centralizing monarchs were now setting economic policy, mercantilism, that demanded the creation of a trade surplus. Now emphasizing economics, these monarchs, seeing past religious divides, allowed and even encouraged Jews to emigrate to their countries and to their cities. Seizing their new opportunities, Jews started to become, in many cases, prominent members of European societies. Meanwhile, as printing developed, religion declined, and societies cohered, rational public participation increased. The Enlightenment began. There were fundamental things about the world that could be discovered through rational thought. Anyone could discover them, so long as they were allowed to participate in the ongoing dialogue. Humanity, it was thought, was bettering itself, becoming wiser, more tolerant, seeing past old irrationalities and divides. A major turning point came with the American Revolution and then the French Revolution. Both wanted societies where individuals, not kings, were sovereign. But the Americans saw their society as largely federal, a patchwork of states, somewhat tentatively held together as a nation. The French, by contrast, placed far more emphasis on there being one sovereign national whole. There was the one nation of France, made up of the French people, and all within France were to understand that and assimilate that into their thinking, into their way of being, and even their way of seeing others. The French way of thinking ended up being far more influential, and societies everywhere began to look around and reorganize themselves as national wholes. In Greece, for example, they said, "We are all Greeks. We must be seen as Greeks, and we must form into one sovereign Greek state." For about the next 100 years after the French Revolution, that process happened for Italy, for Germany, Poland, countries all over Europe, and across the Americas as well. But Jews, in that time, crucially, abstained. Being minorities, they didn't hold a majority anywhere that could readily nationalize and claim a territory. There were a few thinkers who did call for Jewish nationalism, and even said things that could be seen as early arguments for Zionism, but nothing came of it. Their work had little influence, and in their time, they were quickly forgotten. Opinions instead among Jews on how to deal with the era were generally split into three groups. First, you had the traditionalists, who held out a hope or a belief in a return to Zion, but believed that it was a divine process that had to be led by a Messiah. Until then, they believed Jews needed to wait. As a medieval rabbi put it, expressing it as the word of God, "I made you an oath, my careful ones, lest you rebel. Await the end of days, and do not tremble." Many claiming to be the Messiah had appeared over the centuries, but in the long run, they had all been proven false. They must have been false messiahs, because the Jewish return to Zion hadn't happened. The second group were the religious reformers. They believed that in light of the climate of political equality and national inclusion at the time, many of their traditional beliefs needed to be dropped, including their long-held wish to return to Zion. Instead, they should see the Bible as a more loosely interpreted moral guide, and should see themselves as being permanently abroad on a mission of Israel. The third camp focused more on the concept of assimilation. They believed that the best course of action, and maybe the inevitable course of action, was to nationally identify and assimilate into the nations around them. As a popular poet put it, be a human being outside and a Jew at home. So they might be, for example, nationally Polish and religiously Jewish, and Poles, these assimilationists believed, would eventually accept them. Many assimilationists took their beliefs to an extreme, wanting to drop the religious practice and even the concept of Judaism entirely. Many did more or less fully assimilate, no longer considering themselves particularly Jewish. Many who did that even became notable members of European societies, like Karl Marx, for example. Meanwhile, across the 19th century, legal rights also spread for Jews, granting Jews legal emancipation, legal equality with their non-Jewish counterparts. The assimilationist argument was widely seen as legitimate and was often convincing. Seeing the assimilation happening, Judaism was even claimed by some to be dead. If not then perhaps in 20 years. But there was another side to this conversation. As these societies, one after the other, started seeing themselves and emphasizing themselves as national wholes, it started to put a new emphasis and a new perspective on those who were, we could say, questionably seen as legitimate members of that national whole. If everyone, for example, was to be German, speak German and act German, and that was to hold true from one end of Germany's border to the other, then it suddenly became quite suspect if there was a town next to you where people spoke, let's say, Yiddish, where people believed in things that seemed strange to Germans and practiced customs that seemed foreign, even heretical. Perhaps they did even speak German, but there was something about them that was foreign, that didn't fit. In short, their membership into the nation of Germany was questionable. That way of thinking, focused on Jews in particular, became literally known as the Jewish question. Were Jews to be fully accepted or not? What would they have to do if there was anything they could do that would make them fully accepted? And if not, then what should be done? Opinions, of course, ranged on the issue. But there was now this intense national attention on Jews, a newly politically organized attention of an entire society on its potentially unwanted minority. As the 19th century went on, Jews visibly made gains in terms of acceptance in European societies. But at the same time, as the 19th century went on, limits to that acceptance became more and more apparent. Richard Wagner, the prominent German composer, perhaps put that dual perspective best in 1848 when he said, "When we strove for emancipation of the Jews, we were more the champions of an abstract principle than of a concrete cause. Just as all our liberalism was not a very lucid mental sport, we championed the freedom of the folk without knowledge of that folk itself, nay, with a dislike of any genuine contact with it. So our eagerness to level up the rights of Jews was far rather stimulated by a general idea than by any real sympathy. For, with all our speaking and writing in favor of the Jews' emancipation, we always felt instinctively repelled by any actual, operative contact with them." Philosophically, Europeans were experiencing the rise of Romanticism, a way of thinking that encouraged you to be in touch with your feelings, with your inner convictions, even if, or even especially if, it meant rejecting reason. When connected to nationalism, it meant that people felt that they were part of a people, and also felt that others were simply not. All they had to do was declare it and feel it, and see others around them doing the same. Because Jews were not accepted as fully legitimate members of the societies that they were in, serious ramifications followed. For example, if you think about it, there are always people close to those in power. A king has advisors, close confidants, for example, who might exert an outsized influence on that society's politics. And there are always people who succeed more than others. Say, for example, in industry, becoming prominent members economically in that society. There's nothing really unusual there happening to speak of. But when Jews integrated, for the most part, into these societies and did those things, it became, in the eyes of many, a problem. In their eyes, Jews were not fully legitimate members of that society. So therefore, Jews had no right to hold influence over that society. Anti-Semitism, as a modern, nationally understood phenomenon, flew in the face of the enlightened optimism that Europeans had experienced since the French Revolution. People were thought to be getting more tolerant, more rational. As these national wholes organized and the Jewish question spread, Jews, for decades, were widely able to look past it, seeing it as a reactionary movement, a sort of historical hiccup that would pass with time. But instead, over time, it became more acute. The ramifications of that first became clear in Eastern Europe, more specifically in the Russian Empire, which at the time stretched over both Poland and Ukraine. Jews existed there at the time in greater numbers than anywhere else in the world. About half the Jews in the world were there. Large enough numbers to maintain a stronger, less assimilated sense of Jewish identity, but not large enough numbers to make a politically powerful majority. Instead, they were legally discriminated against, forced to live in economically poorer areas known collectively as the Pale of Settlement. So in the age of nationalism, when people were thinking as one and framing their friends, their enemies, who belongs and who doesn't in those terms, Jews in Russia had perhaps the worst combination of qualities. As a minority that didn't fit in, they were highly conspicuous and also largely powerless. In 1871, in Odessa, anti-Jewish sentiment reached a boiling point, and mob violence against Jews, called a pogrom, began. But it only went on for a few days and wasn't seen as anything too far from the long-term historical norm. But then when the Russian Tsar was assassinated, 10 years later, in 1881, one of the conspirators was Jewish. If Jews were not one of them, then they certainly didn't have the right to participate in the killing of their Tsar. That amounted then, in Russia, to a national outrage, and this time, an intense wave of pogroms followed. A theologian and future Zionist recorded his first-hand account of it. To give you a less abstract idea of what we're talking about here, I think I should read it. But perhaps needless to say, it's not emotionally light material. March 20th. The local periodical reported that the masses are ready to attack the Jews during the approaching Easter holiday. Apparently, the anti-Semites are not satisfied with the famine that is ravaging the Jews in their Pale of Settlement, and are inciting the masses to loot and pillage. But why do they labor in vain to bring back their beloved Middle Ages? For that age will never return. April 10th. The disturbing rumors about anti-Jewish outbreaks are growing stronger, and the governor has seen fit to post notices throughout the city to the effect that if anyone tries to disturb the peace and order of the city, he, the governor himself, will immediately cut off all services and have the agitators court-martialed. April 17th. Shocking reports from the city of Elizabethrad. Riots. Pillaging. The heart fails. What is this? April 28th. Reports as shocking as those from Elizabethrad now come from Kyiv and other cities. May 5th. Terrible. The situation is terrible and frightening. We are virtually under siege. The courtyards are barred up, and we keep peering through the grillwork of the court gates to see if the mob is coming to swoop down on us. All the furniture is stored in cellars, and we all sleep in our clothes and without any bedding, so that if we are attacked, we will immediately be able to take the small children, who also sleep in their clothes, and flee. But will they let us flee? What does the future have in store for us? Will they have mercy on the youngsters, who don't even know yet that they are Jews, that they are wretches, and not harm them? Terrible, terrible. How long, O God of Israel? The pogroms ended up lasting this time for 2 years. It was a traumatic and widely discussed event for Jews around the world. Far from stopping the pogroms, the Russian government was, somewhat controversially but widely, seen as abetting them. The pogroms triggered a migration crisis, as Jews en masse tried to flee the violence, and it was in that context that Zionism, as a movement, first appeared. It was first led by a piece of writing that came from a man named Leo Pinsker. Pinsker had been one of the leading advocates in Russia of cultural assimilation, but the pogroms to Pinsker discredited assimilation. He declared that new remedies and new ways would have to be found. His basic idea for Jews going forward was captured in the name of a pamphlet that he wrote called Auto-Emancipation, or Self-Emancipation. It begins, "The eternal problem presented by the Jewish question stirs men today as it did ages ago. It remains unsolved like the squaring of a circle, but unlike it, it is still a burning question. This is due to the fact that it is not merely a problem of theoretic interest, but one of practical interest, which renews its youth from day to day, as it were, and presses more and more urgently for a solution. The essence of the problem, as we see it, lies in the fact that, in the midst of the nations among whom the Jews reside, they form a distinctive element which cannot be assimilated, which cannot be readily digested by any nation. Hence the problem is to find the means of so adjusting the relations of this exclusive element to the whole body of the nations that there shall never be any further basis for the Jewish question." In short, he believed Jews could no longer rely on the goodwill of the nations of the world to render them safe and establish them as equals. They would have to take their political well-being as a national group into their own hands. It was a process that would have to begin with Jews reasserting themselves as a national group. "It is truly the greatest misfortune of our race," he said, "that we do not constitute a nation, that we are merely Jews. We are a flock scattered across the whole face of the earth, without a shepherd to protect us and gather us together." As a modern nation, though, Jews would need a territory where they could express their own national sovereignty, a territory where Jews could live free of persecutions as a minority. But he urged open-mindedness about where that territory could be. He said, "If we would have a secure home so that we may give up our endless life of wandering and rehabilitate our nation in our own eyes and in the eyes of the world, we must, above all, not dream of restoring ancient Judea. We must not attach ourselves to the place where our political life was once violently interrupted and destroyed. The goal of our present endeavors must not be the Holy Land, but a land of our own. We need nothing but a large piece of land for our poor brothers, a piece of land which shall remain our property, from which no foreign master can expel us." Pinsker went mostly unnoticed in the West, but was widely read among literate Russian Jews. At that point in time, as one historian put it, Pinsker should be considered a territorialist and not a Zionist, since he believed that Jews should specifically not move back to Zion. But it was a point that Pinsker was persuaded to change his mind on. Pinsker's political impact overall was limited, but for many, particularly in Russia, Pinsker's writing resounded. It hit a nerve. His ideas began to spread. Assimilation was failing, they thought, and Jews needed to stop being subjects of national abuse. They needed to come together and find a national home, somewhere where they could live, governing themselves, free from the Jewish question. Several locations for that Jewish national home were suggested, but only one place was ever able to seem, generally speaking, correct. Only one place was ever able to create general agreement among Jews as the goal, and that was the place that had been promised to Jews by God in the Hebrew Bible, a place that had long lingered in Jewish consciousness, but all of a sudden started to seem like a real possibility. And that was, of course, Palestine. To get that process started, to make Palestine into the Jewish national home, Jews, it was thought, would have to start by emigrating there. Organizations to begin that process of emigration in the years following the pogroms sprang up across Russia, calling themselves collectively the Lovers of Zion. In 1884, they came together for their first conference. Pinsker was elected president, and preached the need to return to the soil. So we're talking here about small groups of people, numbering in the dozens or perhaps in the hundreds, moving and settling in Palestine, in a process they called an aliyah, a Hebrew word meaning ascent. In this context, an ascent to the Holy Land. Palestine at the time was somewhat sparsely populated, with about 380,000 people living across the whole territory. Less than 10% of them were Jewish, most of whom lived in Jerusalem, where they did somewhat slightly hold a majority. The population otherwise was overwhelmingly Arab. There were a sizable number of Christians there, both Arab and non-Arab. But the Arab population on the whole was overwhelmingly Muslim. Palestine was technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but under the Ottomans was not its own discrete political unit. It had vague borders with different parts that fell under different, typically loose jurisdictions. Modern development had only barely begun there. Its first road, for example, had only been built about 12 years earlier. To the Jewish colonists' relatively modern European eyes, Palestine was not being used and perhaps cared for or governed to their standards. An early colonist, author, and wife of the man who revived Hebrew in Palestine, captured the disparity that Jews felt coming from Europe with Arabs there, when she said, "I was shocked by the Arab village I saw. Houses made of mud, without windows, housing both men and animals. Piles of garbage everywhere, and half-naked children. Old blind women and dirty girls sit in front of the houses, working, grinding wheat, as was done 1,000 years ago." Also crucially, in the age of nationalism, when so many territories around the world had already been claimed, Palestine seemed like a tantalizingly free option. The Arabs there cared for and had an attachment to the land that they were living on, but they weren't yet united or nationalized. Palestinians had not yet formed as an identity group. So crucially, no nation had yet made an internationally recognized legal claim to the territory, which is, speaking in the modern sense, of course, that became the standard after the French Revolution. So Jews, seeing the opportunity, more or less just started taking the land. They began moving there and buying plots, even if it meant still living under Ottoman jurisdiction, and then working the land to begin development, for example by draining swamps. Celebrating the founding of a town, a poem was written that went, "As long as deep in the heart the soul of a Jew yearns, and towards the east an eye looks to Zion, our hope is not yet lost, the age-old hope, to return to the land of our fathers, to the city where David dwelt." Within a few years, the second verse was changed. "Our hope is not yet lost, the hope of 2,000 years, to be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem." A poem that would go on to become Israel's national anthem. The Arabs widely saw the colonization, as you could expect any people to, as an invasion, as an existential threat to their home. The idea that Jews were having problems in Europe wasn't relevant, or perhaps even known by them. The important thing was that they had a home, and it was a home being taken. Jews, for their part, typically spoke of their intentions at the time in idealistic terms, in terms of equality, of shared prosperity, of peaceful cohabitation. They virtually never spoke publicly about wanting a separate, distinctly Jewish state. But their intentions were widely understood to be closer to those expressed by a colonist in the first Aliyah, when he said, "My ultimate aim is to eventually gain control of Palestine, and to restore to the Jewish people the political independence of which it has been deprived for 2,000 years. A view that may have been a minority one to start, or perhaps existed fuzzily in the minds of many Jews at the time, but certainly became more clear and more popular over the years. But even then, how much of Palestine Jews wanted was, and would continue to be, ambiguous. Seeking a solution, the Arabs petitioned the Ottoman Sultan to intervene. The Sultan was the self-proclaimed caliph, the leader of Muslims, and considered it his duty to prioritize the needs of Muslims under his rule. He did take legal action against the settlers, but the law was loose, and loopholes, even if it meant bribery, were widespread. In those small-scale, discreet, and often illicit circumstances, the Jewish colonization of Palestine began. A journal in Vienna coined a term to make sense of the movement it was seeing: the movement that had formed in the wake of the pogroms and Pinsker's writing. The term was called Zionism. But it was still a small movement with little in the way of traction, even with Russian Jewry. Most Jews wanted to live where they were, to assimilate where they were. Palestine was a faraway place. It was undeveloped, even unsafe. The prospect of Jews ever gaining political autonomy there seemed like a long shot, even ridiculous. Who wanted to risk themselves and their families to go there? And who wanted to support Zionism if it meant undermining their own claims to assimilation where they were? In short, in order for the Jews of the world to accept Zionism en masse and want to move to Palestine en masse, prospects for their own well-being, where they were, across Europe, would have to worsen. In Europe, across the second half of the 19th century, anti-Semitism overtly spread and, you could say, deepened. A popular book by Eugen de Ring called The Jewish Question as a Problem of Race, Morals, and Civilization went beyond the traditional cultural or religious analysis to argue that one should think about being Jewish in racial terms. And in those racial terms, he said, Jews were inferior. They were racially depraved, which meant that Jews could no longer assimilate to improve themselves in the eyes of these anti-Semites. Their inferiority was an innate problem, something that Jews could more or less do nothing about. In Vienna, a young playwright and assimilationist named Theodor Herzl felt shaken awake by the book. As he put it years later, the book was as full of hate as it is brilliant. The effect of the book upon me was if I had suddenly been hit over the head. I suppose this has been the experience of many a Western Jew who had already completely forgotten his national identity. The anti-Semites reawakened it in him. As a journalist then in Paris, Herzl noted that Jews were being blamed for all sorts of problems. He reported crowds in the streets shouting, "Down with the Jews," outraged by a scandal that Jews, he reported, had nothing to do with. In 1894, he was assigned to cover the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a captain in the French army accused of having given information to the Germans, an act of treason. Crucially, Dreyfus was Jewish. It was widely believed by the French that Jews were less loyal, and his Jewishness became the lens through which his trial was seen. Many suspected that Dreyfus had been framed, that the charges against him had been drummed up. Herzl himself made his sympathies clear. A Jew who, as an officer on the general staff, has before him an honorable career, cannot commit such a crime. The trial bitterly divided French public opinion. Half the public fervently declared his guilt in unambiguous anti-Semitic terms. Dreyfus was pronounced guilty. Herzl then watched him be stripped of his rank, while the gathered crowd shouted, "Down with the Jews." 4 years later, it was uncovered that the prosecution relied on falsified evidence, which led to Dreyfus being eventually exonerated. For Herzl, the trial was a tipping point that broke his belief in assimilation. As he put it, the trial embodies the desire of the vast majority of the French to condemn a Jew and to condemn all Jews in this one Jew. He from there consciously set out to become a leader of a mass movement. He started a diary and in it wrote, "Today I am an isolated and lonely man. Tomorrow, the intellectual leader of hundreds of thousands. In any case, the discoverer and proclaimer of a mighty idea." In reality, he was almost entirely ignorant of the history of Zionism that had come before him. What set him apart wasn't the originality of his ideas, but his recognition that the movement needed a spark. It needed an energetic leader, and through that leader, momentum. He published a pamphlet in 1896 called The Jewish State: Modern Solutions for the Jewish Question. It begins, "The idea which I have developed in this pamphlet is an ancient one. It is the restoration of the Jewish state. The world resounds with clamor against the Jews, and this has revived the dormant idea. We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It is not permitted to us." He believed, like Pinsker, that the creation of a Jewish state would save Jews, the ones who wished to use it, from whatever traumas awaited them due to the insolvency of the Jewish question. But Herzl focused on the mobilizing power of an idea. No human being is wealthy or powerful enough to transplant a people from one place of residence to another, he said. Only an idea can achieve that. The state idea surely has that power. The Jews have dreamed this princely dream throughout the long night of their history. Next year in Jerusalem is our age-old motto. It is now a matter of showing that the vague dream can be transformed into a clear and glowing idea. The whole plan is essentially quite simple, as it must necessarily be if it is to be comprehensible to all. Let sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe adequate to meet our rightful national requirements. We will attend to the rest. Under Herzl's leadership, Zionism gained new momentum, and of course culminated in the proclamation of the State of Israel in 1948. But it would be a long path, one punctuated by triumphs, conflicts, setbacks, controversy,
le plus grand scandale politique de tous les siècles,
and catastrophe. In short, it would be a long, complicated story, and a story told next time.